At 16:38 hours on June 8, 1940, Lieutenant Commander Charles Glassford stood on the bridge of HMS Acasta watching two German battleships close from 15,000 yards. The battleships were Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, each displacing 32,000 tons, mounting 9 11-inch guns capable of 31 knots. Between them, they carried 18 heavy guns that could destroy a destroyer with a single salvo. Acasta displaced 350 tons. She mounted 4 4.7-inch guns and 8 torpedoes. Her maximum speed was 36 knots, but after 3 weeks of continuous operations evacuating troops from Norway, her machinery was worn and her fuel tanks were nearly empty. Against 2 battleships, she had no chance of survival. But 20 miles ahead, aircraft carrier HMS Glorious was steaming south toward Scapa Flow with 2 other destroyers as escorts. Glorious carried 50 aircraft and about 200 men. If the German battleships caught her, she would be destroyed in minutes. Carriers had no armor to resist battleship shells. A single 11-inch hit could penetrate her flight deck and detonate in the hangar among fueled and armed aircraft. Glassford's mission was simple and suicidal. Keep the German battleships focused on Acasta. Give Glorious time to escape. Launch torpedoes if possible. Die buying minutes for the carrier to run. At 16:40 hours, Scharnhorst's forward turrets fired. 3 11-inch shells arced through the afternoon sky, taking 30 seconds to cover 15,000 yards. They landed 200 yards short of Acasta, throwing up columns of water that drenched her forward deck. The Germans had her range. The next salvo would be closer. Glassford ordered emergency turn to port and increased speed to 32 knots all his worn machinery could produce. Acasta heeled over sharply. Her 4.7-inch guns fired back at the battleships, a defiant gesture that would accomplish nothing at this range. The shells could not penetrate battleship armor, even at point-blank range, and at 15,000 yards, they could barely reach the targets. But Glassford was not trying to sink battleships with 4.7-inch guns. He was trying to get close enough to launch torpedoes. British destroyer torpedoes had a maximum range of 6,000 yards at high-speed settings. To reach the battleships, Acasta would have to close from 15,000 yards to 6,000 yards while under fire from 18 11-inch guns and 24 5.9-inch secondary guns. The odds of survival were 0. Glassford knew it. His crew knew it. But behind them, Glorious was making smoke and running south. Every minute Acasta stayed afloat was another minute Glorious had to escape. So Acasta charged toward the battleships, and the men aboard her prepared to die. This was the last act of a destroyer that had spent 6 years of war and peace doing what destroyers always did: screening larger ships, escorting convoys, conducting patrols, fighting enemies many times her size. HMS Acasta was not famous. She was not the newest or fastest or most powerful destroyer in the Royal Navy. But in the last 40 minutes of her life, she would demonstrate what small warships crewed by brave men could accomplish against impossible odds. The story of HMS Acasta began on August 21, 1929, when she was laid down at John Brown and Company shipyard in Clydebank, Scotland. She was the 7th ship of the A-class destroyers, a design intended to replace the World War I-era destroyers that formed the bulk of the Royal Navy's destroyer force. The A-class design specified 350 tons, standard displacement, 323 feet length, overall 33 feet beam, and maximum speed of 35 knots. Armament consisted of 4 4.7-inch Mark 9 guns in single mounts, 2 forward and 2 aft. Anti-aircraft armament included 2 2-pounder pom-poms. Torpedo armament was 8 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quadruple mounts amidships. Propulsion came from 3 Admiralty 3-drum boilers generating steam for Parsons geared turbines producing 34,000 shaft horsepower driving 2 propeller shafts. Fuel capacity was 390 tons of oil, giving a range of 4,800 nautical miles at 15 knots. Crew complement was 138 officers and men. HMS Acasta was launched on August 8, 1930 and commissioned on February 11, 1931, assigned to the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla of the Home Fleet. For the next 9 years, she operated with the Home Fleet, conducting peacetime duties, fleet exercises, patrol operations, courtesy visits to foreign ports, and training exercises. In 1936, Acasta was assigned to the Mediterranean Fleet during the Abyssinian Crisis and Spanish Civil War. She conducted patrols protecting British shipping and monitoring naval movements. In 1937, she returned to the Home Fleet and continued routine operations until war was declared on September 3, 1939. When war began, Acasta was assigned to convoy escort duties protecting merchant ships crossing the Atlantic from German submarine attack. Convoy escort was tedious, exhausting work. Destroyers spent weeks at sea in all weather conditions, searching for submarines that might or might not be present, maintaining station around slow merchant ships, responding to every suspicious contact. In October 1939, Acasta was reassigned to the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla operating from Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands. The flotilla's mission was screening capital ships of the Home Fleet, protecting them from submarine attack while they conducted operations in the North Sea and Norwegian waters. On April 9, 1940, Germany invaded Norway. British and French forces attempted to intervene, landing troops at Narvik Namsos and Åndalsnes to support Norwegian resistance. The campaign was poorly planned and inadequately supported. German air superiority made daylight operations nearly impossible. British forces lacked artillery armor and air cover. By late May, evacuation was ordered. Acasta participated in Operation Alphabet, the evacuation of Allied forces from northern Norway. Between May 28 and June 8, 1940, British and French warships evacuated 25,000 troops from Narvik and surrounding areas. The operation was conducted under constant threat of German air attack and submarine action. On June 7, 1940, Acasta was assigned to escort HMS Glorious, an aircraft carrier returning to Britain with RAF Hurricane fighters that had been operating from Norwegian airfields. The Hurricanes could not fly the 700 miles back to Britain and had to be transported by carrier. 2 RAF squadrons totaling 10 Hurricanes were embarked on Glorious plus her own Fleet Air Arm aircraft. The escort group consisted of Glorious destroyers HMS Acasta and HMS Ardent, and initially 2 additional destroyers and the cruiser HMS Devonshire. But Devonshire and the other destroyers detached on June 7th for separate missions. By June 8th, Glorious was steaming south with only Acasta and Ardent as escorts. This decision violated Royal Navy doctrine that carriers should never operate without adequate destroyer screens. Standard procedure called for at least 4 destroyers to screen a carrier, providing anti-submarine protection and early warning. 2 destroyers were insufficient. Captain Guy D'Oyly Hughes, commanding Glorious, made several additional decisions that increased risk. He did not maintain air patrols. Glorious had 50 aircraft embarked, but kept none airborne for reconnaissance. He did not maintain radio watch on fleet frequencies. He steamed independently without coordinating with other British forces in the area. He maintained straight course and speed without zigzagging. These decisions were later criticized as reckless. D'Oyly Hughes was known as difficult and temperamental. He had clashed with his air group commander and reportedly was in a hurry to reach Scapa Flow to press charges against the officer for insubordination. Whether his personal disputes influenced his operational decisions is uncertain, but his ship handling that day violated basic security procedures. At 15:45 hours on June 8, German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau spotted smoke on the horizon. The German ships were returning to Germany, after successfully completing Operation Juno, an operation to attack Allied shipping supporting the Norway evacuation. They had sunk the empty transport Orama and the armed merchant cruiser Orama earlier that day. Admiral Wilhelm Marschall, commanding the German force, ordered his ships to investigate. As they approached, they identified the smoke as coming from a large warship and 2 destroyers. By 1600 hours, German lookouts identified the large ship as an aircraft carrier. Marschall faced a decision. His orders were to attack Allied shipping, but avoid unnecessary risk to his capital ships. Engaging an escorted carrier was risky. If the carrier launched torpedo bombers, if British battleships were nearby, if submarines were in the area, his ships could be damaged or sunk far from friendly ports. But Marschall also understood that sinking a British aircraft carrier would be a major strategic victory. Carriers were irreplaceable. Britain had only 6 operational fleet carriers. Sinking one would significantly damage British naval power. The opportunity might never come again. Marschall ordered pursuit. Both battleships increased speed to 28 knots and maneuvered to close the range. The Germans had a significant speed advantage. Glorious's maximum speed was 30 knots, but after weeks of continuous operations, her machinery could barely maintain 26 knots. The battleships would catch her within 2 hours. At 16:30 hours, Glorious's lookouts spotted the German ships. Captain D'Oyly Hughes ordered emergency turn and increased speed to maximum. He did not launch aircraft. Glorious would need to turn into the wind to launch, and that would bring her closer to the German battleships. He apparently calculated that running was the only chance of escape. That calculation was wrong. With a speed disadvantage of at least 2 knots, Glorious could not outrun the German ships. Her only chance was to launch torpedo bombers immediately and attack the battleships, forcing them to maneuver defensively and buying time for Glorious to escape. But D'Oyly Hughes did not launch aircraft, and the opportunity was lost. At 16:32 hours, Scharnhorst opened fire at 24,000 yards. The first salvo fell short. Scharnhorst's fire control adjusted and fired again at 16:34 hours. The second salvo straddled Glorious. One 11-inch shell hit the carrier's bridge, killing D'Oyly Hughes and most of his command staff instantly. Another shell hit the flight deck, penetrating into the hangar and starting fires among parked aircraft. Glorious was crippled with the first hits. With her bridge destroyed and her captain dead, command and control collapsed. Damage control parties fought fires in the hangar, but fuel and ammunition were exploding. The flight deck was torn open. The ship took a list to starboard as water flooded damaged compartments. Destroyers Acasta and Ardent moved to defend the carrier. This was destroyer doctrine in every navy. When your main force unit is under attack, the destroyers screen with their lives. They attack the enemy. They lay smoke. They draw fire. They die so that the larger ship might survive. Ardent attacked, first charging toward the battleships at maximum speed while laying smoke. At 16:25 hours, both German battleships shifted fire to Ardent. The destroyer disappeared in a forest of shell splashes as dozens of heavy and secondary guns targeted her. At 16:38 hours, multiple hits smashed Ardent. She lost power, caught fire, and began sinking. She would capsize at 17:25 hours with only 2 survivors from a crew of 152. Acasta continued toward the battleships alone. Glasford ordered his ship to make smoke and weave erratically to avoid the incoming fire. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were now firing at both Acasta and Glorious simultaneously. The volume of fire was incredible. Dozens of shells fell around Acasta every minute. At 16:40 hours, a shell hit Acasta's forward boiler room. The explosion killed everyone in the space and vented steam throughout the forward section. Speed dropped from 32 knots to 25 knots. Another hit struck the bridge, wounding Glasford and killing several officers. But Acasta kept coming. Glassford remained on his feet, directing the ship toward the battleships. The range was now 12,000 yards, still too far for effective torpedo attack. Acasta needed to close to 6,000 yards or less to have any chance of hitting. At 16:45 hours, more hits struck Acasta. One shell destroyed the aft 4.7-inch gun mount, killing the entire crew. Another hit struck amidships near the torpedo mounts. The ship was on fire in multiple locations. Casualties were mounting. The surgeon and medical staff were overwhelmed treating wounded men in the wardroom. Range to the battleships was now 8,000 yards. Close enough. Glassford ordered fire torpedoes. Leading seaman Carter, wounded and burned, but still at his post, fired the port torpedoes at Scharnhorst. 4 torpedoes launched at 16:48 hours. The torpedoes ran straight and true. German lookouts spotted the torpedo tracks and reported them to Scharnhorst's captain. The battleship turned hard to port, attempting to comb the torpedoes. 3 torpedoes missed. The 4th hit Scharnhorst on the starboard side, below sea turret. The explosion tore a 40-foot hole in Scharnhorst's hull. Water flooded into compartments adjacent to the torpedo hit. The ship took a 3-degree list to starboard. Speed dropped from 28 knots to 20 knots as flooded compartments created drag. Most critically, one of Scharnhorst's 3 engine rooms flooded, reducing power by 1/3. The torpedo hit was not fatal. Scharnhorst's damage control parties contained the flooding within 20 minutes. But the damage meant Scharnhorst could no longer maintain pursuit speed. Admiral Marshall faced a new calculation. His flagship was damaged and taking water. Continuing the pursuit risked additional torpedo hits from a crippled destroyer that had already proven it could strike back. More importantly, Acasta had transmitted radio warnings before being silenced. British forces now knew German battleships were in this area. Submarines might be vectoring toward the scene. Aircraft from British bases could arrive within hours. The strategic situation had changed from a low-risk opportunity to a high-risk engagement. At 16:50 hours, Marshall ordered both battleships to finish off the British ships and withdraw north. Both battleships concentrated their fire on Glorious and Acasta. The carrier was burning furiously, listing heavily, but still afloat. The destroyer was barely moving on fire from stem to stern, but incredibly still, fighting back with her one remaining gun. At 16:58 hours, a salvo of 11-inch shells hit Glorious's waterline on the port side. The shells penetrated deep into the ship and exploded in machinery spaces. The carrier immediately took a severe list. Secondary explosions from magazines and aviation fuel tanks followed. At 1700 hours, Glorious capsized and sank. Of 200 men aboard, only 43 would survive. Acasta lasted another 20 minutes. German guns continued firing at the destroyer even though she was clearly sinking. At 1720 hours, Acasta rolled over and sank by the stern. Of 160 men aboard, there would be only one survivor. That survivor was leading seaman Nick Carter, the man who had fired the torpedoes that hit Scharnhorst. Carter was blown into the water by an explosion and found himself swimming among debris and fuel oil. He grabbed a floating raft and pulled himself aboard. Around him, other men were in the water, some wounded, some dying, some already dead. The German battleships did not stop to rescue survivors. They continued north at reduced speed, Scharnhorst nursing her torpedo damage. Over the next 3 days, men died in the water from wounds, exposure, and drowning. Ships and aircraft searched the area, but weather was poor and debris fields were scattered over dozens of square miles. On June 11th, a Norwegian ship picked up 43 survivors from Glorious. On June 13th, another Norwegian ship picked up leading seaman Carter, the sole survivor of Acasta. He had been in the water for 5 days, the last 2 days alone on his raft after the other men sharing it had died. Carter was suffering from severe exposure fuel oil ingestion and shock. Carter was taken to a Norwegian hospital, then evacuated to Britain. After recovering, he provided the only eyewitness account of Acasta's final battle. His testimony described how Glasford had deliberately drawn the German ship's attention, how the crew had fought their guns until they were destroyed, how the torpedoes had been fired with the ship already sinking. Carter specifically remembered Glasford's final words to the crew before the last German salvo hit. "You may not live to see it, but history will remember this day." Those words, if accurate, captured what Acasta's crew understood. They were dying not for victory, but for time. Time for Glorious to escape, time for other British ships to be warned, time bought with their lives. The strategic impact of Acasta's sacrifice was significant, though not immediate. Glorious sank despite Acasta's efforts to save her. But Scharnhorst's torpedo damage forced the German battleships to break off operations and return to port for repairs. Scharnhorst would be in dock for 3 months. During those 3 months, she could not attack convoys, could not support the invasion of Britain, could not threaten British operations in the Atlantic. More importantly, Acasta's radio warning, before she was silenced, altered British naval dispositions. The home fleet, believing German battleships were at sea, moved forces to intercept. This movement disrupted German planning for subsequent operations and forced Germany to be more cautious about deploying capital ships where they might encounter British forces. The loss of Glorious was catastrophic. Britain could not afford to lose carriers. The destruction of 50 aircraft and 1 whole 200 experienced naval personnel was equally damaging. But Acasta had demonstrated that small ships could damage capital ships if handled aggressively. That lesson would be applied repeatedly as the war progressed. After the war, investigations examined why Glorious had been caught unaware and inadequately protected. Captain D'Oyly Hughes was criticized for poor ship handling, failure to maintain air patrols, failure to maintain radio watch, and inadequate screening arrangements. His death prevented him from defending his decisions, but the consensus was that multiple errors in judgment led to the disaster. The decision to detach most of Glorious's escorts on June 7th was also questioned. If the full escort had remained with the carrier, if 4 or 6 destroyers had screened instead of 2, could the outcome have been different? Possibly. More destroyers could have launched more torpedoes, forced the German ships to maneuver more defensively, bought more time. But ultimately, a carrier operating within range of enemy capital ships, without air cover and adequate escorts, was doomed regardless of how many destroyers screened her. The fundamental error was strategic, sending Glorious home independently instead of in convoy with other major units. HMS Acasta received no battle honors for June 8, 1940, because the action was considered a defeat. She was simply listed as lost in action off Norway. No memorials were erected, no streets were named after her. For decades after the war, Acasta was a footnote in histories of the Norwegian campaign. But among Royal Navy destroyer crews, Acasta's last battle became legendary. The story of the destroyer that charged 2 battleships and landed a torpedo hit while her own ship was sinking represented everything the destroyer service valued: courage, aggression, and sacrifice. Destroyer crews knew what Acasta's crew had done and why they had done it. In 1995, the wreck of Glorious was found by Norwegian researchers using side-scan sonar. The carrier lies in 1/800 meters of water, broken into several sections. The wrecks of Acasta and Ardent were located nearby, both lying in deep water, where they sank 55 years earlier. All 3 wrecks are designated war graves protected by British law. Leading seaman Nick Carter, Acasta's sole survivor, returned to sea after recovering from his injuries. He served throughout the rest of the war and retired from the Royal Navy in 1955. He rarely spoke publicly about June 8, 1940, but attended memorial services for Acasta's crew. He died in 1999 at age 82, the last man who witnessed Acasta's final battle. The 159 men who died aboard Acasta were typical Royal Navy sailors, professional seamen, reservists, called up at the war's start, young men who had joined to see the world. Most were in their 20s, some left families, some did not. All died, doing what their service required, protecting larger ships with their lives. Lieutenant Commander Charles Glassford was posthumously mentioned in dispatches for his handling of Acasta during the final action. Leading Seaman Carter was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his actions in firing the torpedoes and surviving 5 days in the water. The rest of the crew received no individual recognition, but their ship's name was added to the memorial at Plymouth that lists all Royal Navy ships lost in action. The tactical lesson of June 8, 1940 was clear: destroyers attacking capital ships face near certain destruction, but can achieve tactical success through aggressive action. Acasta proved that even a hopelessly outgunned ship can damage enemies many times her size if the crew fights skillfully and bravely. That lesson would be repeated throughout World War II. At the battle off Samar in October 1944, American destroyers attacked Japanese battleships to protect escort carriers launching torpedoes at point-blank range and sacrificing themselves to save the carriers. The tactics were identical to what Acasta had done 4 years earlier. The strategic lesson was more complex. Small ships cannot substitute for adequate forces. Acasta's sacrifice was necessary because Glorious was inadequately protected. If proper escort forces had been provided, if air patrols had been maintained, if radio watch had been kept, the battle might never have occurred or might have ended differently. But circumstances often force small ships to face impossible odds. When that happens, the question is not whether the small ship can win, it cannot, but whether it can delay the enemy long enough for something else to happen. Can it buy time for a carrier to escape, for reinforcements to arrive, for a convoy to scatter, for a submarine to get into position? Acasta bought time. Not enough time to save Glorious, but enough time to cripple Scharnhorst and force the German battleships to withdraw. In the cold mathematics of war, that was success, even though Acasta was destroyed achieving it. Modern destroyers are far more capable than Acasta was in 1940. They carry guided missiles that can strike targets beyond visual range, sophisticated radars that can track hundreds of contacts, simultaneously anti-submarine weapons that can kill submarines 20 miles away, but they remain fundamentally what destroyers have always been: small, fast warships that screen larger ships and accept combat against heavier enemies when necessary. The crew of HMS Acasta understood that role perfectly. When German battleships appeared on June 8, 1940, when it became clear that Glorious was going to be caught, when the choice was to run or fight, they chose to fight. They charged toward enemies they could not defeat. They fired torpedoes from a sinking ship. They died buying minutes for others to escape. That was their duty. That was what destroyers did. That was what made the sacrifice heroic, rather than futile. They did not die for nothing. They died for time, and time in warfare is often the most precious resource. The story of HMS Acasta is not about victory. It is about sacrifice made willingly by men who understood the cost and accepted it anyway. It is about small ships taking on impossible odds, not because they expect to win, but because someone has to try. It is about the destroyer service's ethos that protecting the main force matters more than the individual survival. That ethos defined destroyer operations throughout World War II in every navy. Destroyers screened battleships, carriers, convoys, and invasion forces. They took the first hits from submarines, aircraft, and surface raiders. They fought battles where survival was unlikely and victory improbable. They did it because that was their role. HMS Acasta did her duty on June 8, 1940. She fought against impossible odds, landed a torpedo hit on a battleship, and bought time even though the time was not enough. Her crew died bravely, doing what sailors have done for centuries, following orders, fighting their ship, and going down with their colors flying. The Royal Navy lost many destroyers during World War II. Most are forgotten except by historians and the families of men who served aboard them. But Acasta deserves to be remembered. Not because she won a great victory, she did not, but because she demonstrated what small ships and brave crews can accomplish even in defeat. On the afternoon of June 8, 1940, as Acasta rolled over and sank in the Norwegian Sea, leading seaman Carter clung to his raft and watched his ship disappear. Around him, his shipmates were dying in the cold water. Behind him, Glorious was sinking with all her aircraft and most of her crew. The German battleships were steaming away to the north. It looked like total defeat. But Scharnhorst was damaged and would be out of action for 3 months. British forces were alerted to German movements. The home fleet was mobilizing. And somewhere in Whitehall, planners were learning lessons about carrier protection and destroyer escort requirements that would save lives later. Acasta had accomplished her mission. Not the mission she sailed with protecting Glorious, but the mission she was forced into buying time against overwhelming force. She had charged toward battleships and fired torpedoes from a sinking deck. She had hit what she aimed at. She had forced the enemy to withdraw. That was what destroyers did. That was why nations built them. That was what made their sacrifice meaningful rather than wasteful. HMS Acasta's crew understood what they were doing and did it anyway. They deserve to be remembered for that courage, that determination, that willingness to die so others might live. That is the story of HMS Acasta. Not the biggest ship, not the most famous battle, not the most decorated unit. Just a destroyer doing her duty against impossible odds and proving that size matters less than courage when the moment demands sacrifice. That lesson remains relevant today, and the men who taught it deserve to be remembered.